Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in speakers from across the country to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. And this is our last presentation of the year. I'm sad that it's our last presentation of the year, but I'm excited that we're going to welcome Dr. Abigail Devereaux today. And so Dr. Abigail Devereaux is an assistant professor of economics and research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Economic Growth at Wichita State University. Her research interests include complexity economics, agent-based computational economics, growth theory, game theory, and the theory of technological innovation and entrepreneurial exit. Her applied research includes work on nudge theory and an analysis of China's social credit system. She received her PhD in economics from George Mason University. And after she's done with her presentation, she'll have time to take questions from you. So please get your questions ready. And without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Abigail Devereaux. So welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm really happy to be talking about this topic. This is something that I've been working on for the past couple of years, and hopefully it's starting to come to fruition. So we have a great group of interdisciplinary researchers working on this project in physics, mathematics, economics, and theoretical biology. We hope that this is a good representation of what we're doing. All right, so today I want to talk about the limits of control in the face of accelerating growth. I need a little help getting past that. Okay, thank you. All right, the question here for a lot of us is, what if growth isn't an attractor? So the way that we understand growth in growth theory is that we've got an attractor state, some kind of equilibrium towards which a system trends. And so all systems, social systems, trend towards some sort of state that is stable. Like if you were to kind of knock it a little off its trajectory, it would be able to find its way back. And sometimes it's already knocked off its trajectory, needs a little bit of help, and you can kind of knock it back towards its optimal growth path. And so all of modern growth theory is predicated on this kind of formalism, this idea that you can just nudge a system back to where it needs to go. Well, nudge or shove, depending on, the situation you find yourself in, the system back to where it needs to go. So the idea of controlling growth or being able to improve growth is something that is an integral part of economic theory and what we do as economists. However, so you do have this constant relative rate of growth idea in modern growth systems, in modern growth theory. But what if you don't have a system that can just be nudged back to where it needs to go, or that can be shoved out of a suboptimal state and stably kind of traverse its path to the more optimal growth state? What if we're not dealing with an attractor? What if we're dealing with a repeller? Let's talk about what that means. With a repeller, we have the question now we have to ask, what if nudging the system in one direction or the other doesn't cause it to just reach the trajectory you want, but can cause it to explode, the system to explode in number of possibilities and opportunities, explosive growth, or can cause it to collapse? And what if you can entirely make the system destroy itself? So in our formalism, we're able to characterize modern growth in a somewhat different way. And we find that, in fact, you are dealing with a situation where you have a repeller state in the rate of growth. So you have, for instance, you are on a knife's edge. Here we are. I will describe what this means. This is basically numbers of opportunities in the system and where you start. And then you try to nudge the system in one way or another. You're destroying an amount of opportunities in order to control it, to get it to fall perfectly on some stable growth path. This is the over time. And what we have happen here is that you either are sending the system to explosive growth, or you are collapsing the system entirely. That you are going to then, and this, of course, that doesn't come back up again. It just keeps going down, down, down. And this is an interesting graph here. My precision on the graph doesn't go far enough to tell you, to show you how thin of a knife's edge this repeller is. So the idea of predicting how to stay stable on a growth path that just continues out straight is something you can't do to a precision of 8 decimal points at least. And I'm giving you here the punchline because then I will motivate that punchline as we go. Oops. Okay. All right, so what we have is part of this punchline is looking at the number of combinations here that we start off with in the system and the fraction of deaths per period. So if you're trying to control a system, you're trying to remove possibilities from that system if it's in a system of explosive growth. If it's in a trajectory of explosive growth, you're trying to remove possibilities in order to control that growth. And we have a 20% removal rate here, 40, 60, 80, 100. And we find that even with a relatively modest amount of initial stuff in the system that can combine with each other and form new stuff, we have a zone of explosion that happens above this line, and we have a zone of collapse. So with a small enough number of initial combinations, if we destroy enough of the stuff, we're just going to send the system into collapse. With a high enough number of combinations, if we don't destroy enough stuff, then the system will explode. And another part of the punchline here, the direct results of this is that when you have accelerated open-ended growth in a system, you're always going to have a lag time between the creation of new opportunities in that system and the ability of, say, administrative state or economists to react to the new stuff being created in the system. And with an accelerating growth model, that gap keeps getting wider and wider and wider. So the more stuff that's created, you have more and more new things entering the system at a faster and faster rate. And the administrative state will just assume it's just operating like normal, and they aren't growing. The administrative state itself is not growing, in size in order to be able to, at the rate it needs to handle these new combinations. Even if it's growing at a reasonable, stable rate of growth, it will not be able to react to the amount of new things in the system. So you're going to have a widening gap. And so the idea here is that the ways that we react as people and as entrepreneurs to new constraints that enter the system, we either comply with them, we either break the new constraints illegally, or we do something called circumnavigate them, right? We figure out ways around the constraints. This is Uber's model of getting around taxi medallions, for instance. This is a new technological idea, a new technology that gets us around the old constraints. And so this was what I call piecemeal circumnavigation, because it happens in a decentralized way. We have actors who aren't coordinating among themselves to circumnavigate new constraints and constrictions of the administrative state. And the idea here is that this piecemeal circumnavigation is going to operate at a faster rate due to its decentralized nature. It will be more computationally efficient as we have this exploding growth. And so you're going to have more and more you're going to not only have the administrative state lagging behind the explosive growth of new opportunities in the system, but you're going to have an outcompeting set of adaptation of people who are adapting to constraints due to their decentralized nature. They are going to outcompete the ability of the state to then react to these circumnavigations of the constraints. So you have a double layer of the ability not to be able to control a system when you have accelerating growth. And so my thesis, the limits of control thesis, is that when you have combinatorial growth, which I will be discussing in detail, then past a certain point in this process, any gap in predicting the trajectory of the system is going to result in explosive growth of the system. And any successful attempt to control the trajectory of the system must, by definition, lead to collapse of the system, because you cannot traverse that knife's edge of a repeller. You cannot traverse it. You cannot successfully walk that knife's edge. Any tiniest deviation of out to a billionth or 100 billionth of a decimal point, of a fraction of a decimal point, will send you off that control path towards collapse or explosion. And so I don't think even the most heroic assumptions about the ability of administrators to constrain a system successfully, I don't think they're that precise, right? I don't think anyone can possibly be that precise. The idea of there's an impossibility to constrain the system along the knife's edge of a repeller. All right, so I've set this all up. I've suggested we have a repeller state. I've given you no evidence. I've shown no model here, no formalism, but that's what I'm going to do next. So first, I would like to talk about Arthur C. Clarke. So Arthur C. Clarke was a science fiction writer. And he was very good at that, but he was also really good at describing the way we think about science. And he had these three laws. And so his first law is when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost certainly right. When he states that something is impossible, he's very probably wrong. His second law, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And his third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what does that mean exactly? Let's think a little bit more about how we actually develop new technologies. So we have the Wright Brothers here. Did they wake up one morning with the full-formed idea of how to put a plane together, without having observed any other kind of device, mechanical device that propels people, and just wake up, a phenol-like popped from their forehead, and they wrote down the blueprints, and there was the plane? Of course not. There had to be several things existing at the time in order for them to be able to think about this. So that we had gliders, and we had a physics of flight in this sense. We had the existing, an airfoil, for instance, existed at the time, the concept of an airfoil, and how flow and vibrations from the flow could keep that wing level or up. We had wheels. That's important because you don't want to crash, and you also need to be able to take off. And so to get enough, propulsion as you're taking off, you need to have something to roll on. You can't, for instance, they weren't going to be developing a glider, which was already in existence, where you're jumping off of a cliff and you use the potential energy from the distance from the cliff to the ground as basically your energy to fly. So you had to get that energy from rolling along the ground. Of course, you also need, I keep doing that. You also need, go away. Please go away. End show, no, I don't want to end show. Okay, you also need an engine, of course. You've got your wheels, you've got your wings, now you've got your engine to push you along, to give you that energy that you need to get off of the ground. So the concept here, and this isn't my theory, this is a theory that's been developed, especially over the past, I'd say 30 years, by Brian Arthur, who's at the Santa Fe Institute, who's a big developer of this, Stu Kaufman, who is a theoretical biologist, who was also at Santa Fe for a little bit, has developed these theories of technology as recombination. And so Jacob in 1977 writes about how humans are tinkerers. Of course, Adam Smith also says that humans tinker and trade. And what we do is that we take things that exist around us sort of normally in our environment, we stick them together and see what happens. That's tinkering. And what if we modeled all technological progress like this? What if we kind of come away from the big idea model of innovation and we just look at it as a process of tinkering? And so what is tinkering? We call that recombination because we have a bunch of things in our environment and we are combining them in different ways than they've already been combined. So recombination. And so we've got some sites there for you with Arthur mainly talking about this. He has a whole book on it that's out pretty recently. So we believe, me and my co-authors, that the story of human flourishing is a story of combinatorial growth, of tinkering. Of course, trade is part of that too. This is a Smithian story. That's the other side of the story. We're not addressing that today. We're talking about tinkering and combinatorial growth. And so in order to have a theory and a formalism of this, we need to talk about something called the theory of the adjacent possible. So what I'm doing here in this project, what we've been doing in this project in the large with my co-authors is trying to formalize innovation in this way. And so Stu Kaufman, some years ago, in his book, The Origins of Order, which is 93, as it says, talks about the theory of adjacent possible. This is where he it brings the idea up the first time. And so the adjacent possible, what is that? This is the full space of what is possible given what exists currently right now. So given the possible, as in what you know exists now, what could exist in the future? There's this idea that there's a space that is kind of contiguous to our existing space that we can kind of look out on and see, not past a certain point, but see a bit into there, things that are possible. This is like the Wright brothers having engines and airfoils and wheels, and then thinking, what if I put them all together? Those and the airfoil, the engines and the wheels had to exist first, but the idea of putting them together does not yet exist. That idea lies in the adjacent possible. So we never actually realize the full potential of the adjacent possible as we move through it. We only are able to move through it given the time and resources that we have. And we often fail to move through it the way we want to. Many entrepreneurial ideas fail. We tinker, we kind of traverse this really, gnarly path through the adjacent possible, right? And we absorb new things, and then that becomes our new possible at the next step. So let's look at what this is like. So suppose you start at this little gray node here. Now the known possibility space, let's represent them by the gray nodes, the dark gray nodes here. And where you've been, where you've traversed, the things you've seen, those edges are solid. So those are the ones where you've been. The nodes you can see to traverse, but you haven't yet been there, those are white. So that's traversable edges you can see, but don't know where they go, are dotted. So these are ones where I know that there's some direction I can go in if I keep working on this idea, but I'm not quite sure where that leads. There's like a question mark on the horizon, but I have this strong intuition that there's something more to this idea. There's something more to this device that I've built. That's the dotted lines. So now let's make this bigger. Suppose you move from this dark gray node to this white node here. And so now you have a new graph that forms based on that movement. So now you're here, and the arrows show where you could go. And now you have all this other stuff out here. What is that? So pink lines are now part of the adjacent possible. So you only see these after moving to the new nodes where you've gone before. So after you move here, you now see parts of things that could be possible that you couldn't see when you were sitting here. The prediction horizon, that's what we call this red line here, which beyond that red line, in all directions, you cannot see. You cannot even see what might be out there. So it's just all question marks. So that's the prediction horizon. We can also model this kind of like a zipper. So if we call the economic opportunity space, the possibility space where we are right now, E, then at each time, we have a current amount of stuff, a possibility space that we can search and arbitrage that exists, that we know these possibilities are known to us. This is like the Wright Brothers with their airfoil, wheel, and engine. So the airfoil, wheel, and engine exists in E at time t, and the adjacent possible at that time would include the airplane. You can see it. You haven't yet made it, right? Once you make it, you move to ET plus 1. And now the airplane is inside this new, larger possibility space. And what is H sub t? That's the prediction horizon. That's that red edge that we showed here that contains all of the possible, the known, the E sub t's, and all of the A sub t's, the adjacent possibles that are out there. And that's the prediction horizon at any time. And so as we move forward, we get new adjacent possibles at each new time step. We get new prediction horizons at each time step. And we keep moving forward and we keep getting these new horizons and adjacent possibles. So it kind of looks like a zipper. Now, controller agents, ones who want to control the trajectory of the system. So basically what is inside the possibility space, they can at best see the possible that exists now plus the adjacent possible, but they cannot verify what is actually going to be part of the possible in the next step. This is the whole entrepreneurial process, right? There have been many entrepreneurs in time who believe that something is going to definitely be possible. They try it and they fail. So controller agents, it's the same thing. They have some view on the adjacent possible, but they don't know what is going to actually constitute the possible on the next step. So we have a way of formalizing this just a little bit further. So there's been a great deal of work done in the theory of open-ended evolution. And so open-ended evolution just means that you don't think ahead of time, that you have some closed space of opportunities over which you can just search and hunt for what you need to do in that space in order to, I don't know, increase your benefit as an individual relative to your cost. This is all of economic theory. Essentially, theory that's been developed is searching over these closed spaces, these known opportunity spaces. So we call this kind of search, actually, it's very simple when it comes to evolving the system. It's type 0 search. And so you're innovating in a sense that you are realizing new things to you as the individual searching the space, but you haven't actually brought anything new into the system. You have a defined search space that's available to everybody to search. And you can search that space. And you're given a certain theory of mind and perhaps a certain utility function that determines where you go and what you're going to be then satisfied with after you find it, what your goals are. And that's all included in what we call type 0, type 1 search, where the theory is closed, the system is closed, and we don't ever think outside those boxes. Now, in order to talk about the adjacent possible, we actually do have to think outside those boxes. We need a new theory. And individuals who want to traverse into the adjacent possible need a new way, often, of looking at the world in order to integrate these new possibilities. Why? Because their theory of mind, their theory of decisions, their decision-making theory is predicated on what they already know and what they've known in the past. But there's unknowable unknowns that will pop up in their adjacent possible that will surprise them. And they're going to have to change the way they think about things in order to then integrate some of these new items. This won't always be true, but it can be true. The idea of man being capable of flying was something that was not in the adjacent possible for a long time. And even then, it was something that required a new way of looking at basically aerospace physics, in order to understand how to fly, how to get man into the air. And so we essentially needed a new theory in order to get us off the ground. And when us as individuals encounter all these new things in the adjacent possible, we often need to alter our theories in order to take into account this new stuff. Subjective probability theory, this idea of having priors that we then turn into posteriors by checking with what's actually happening in the system. It's possible to have a consistent theory like this that's consistent with everything else that we've been able to understand as we move through these systems, if we have one theory of consistency that remains true as we evolve into the future. But what if a bunch of what we thought was true becomes untrue? So essentially, this is something that no known theory of search that we have, including subjective probability theory, can deal with. And type 2 movement, so having to get a new theory to understand these unknowable unknowns, this is how we describe us being able to grapple with and grok these new technological advancements that look like magic, in Clarke's words. And you know what? This magical innovation happening all the time, probably happening right now a little bit, as maybe some of you think about things that I'm talking about, integrate it with stuff that you know, and it gives you a new idea. That idea may not exist in our current possibility space at all. You may need a whole new theory of mind in order to grapple with that idea. And so this magical innovation is very much a part of human life. Now, one of the theoretical innovations that my co-authors have made was to develop a theory of combinatorial growth. And so this formalism here merely describes how we start with a certain amount of stuff and we add to that stuff at any time. So M sub t here is a distinct number of goods or opportunities or things in the system. And P represents the probability that combining n of these things, some abstract amount, results in a new good. And that then is a probability that can increase or suppress the activity of what's happening inside here. Alpha sub I is the probability that basically you're able to combine either a large number of things or small. It's easier to combine a small number of things. And so that probability goes up that if you try to combine 2 or 3 things, you're going to get a new valid combination that works, that can be brought into the possible. So you're going to get a higher probability that those things work. As the number of things you're trying to combine together gets larger and larger and larger, and then that probability that what you're trying to make work to bring into the possibility space goes down. And so we generally cap that at 4, which we find to be pretty reasonable looking at actual data compared to actual data. And so what does this thing do? So what this thing does is it explodes after a certain point in time. There's a very, very small amount of growth. We're bringing new things into the system with a very initially small number of things, bringing in new stuff. And then suddenly, at a certain point, it just flies up. And so the amount of things in the system explodes. And I did put this on a scale of years, essentially, because what we're doing next is we're theorizing about growth. When you theorize about technology, you're theorizing about growth. And we look at the actual GDP, the real GDP, as it's increased from 80 essentially to now. So this is based on Madison's estimates. These, of course, we don't have data from this point in time. We use the theory developed by Madison as to how he can get these levels. And there's been a bunch of macroeconomists who have worked on basically verifying this is kind of what we see down here, is a lot of low growth throughout these centuries. And then suddenly we have this turn of a hockey stick happening in the late 19th century, mid-late 19th century, kind of also 17, like 17, 1800s, 1900s, they're all kind of right here. Oh, we got 16, 17, 18, yeah, so it's 1900s here. And it starts really about mid-19th century. And then we see this explosive growth. And so we think that one can be related to the other. An accelerating growth model may be a really good way of talking about actual growth. But what do we theorize about growth right now? So economies grow in what ways? How do they grow? Jones and Romer, who are the top growth theorists right now, I'd say, of the economic community, believe that economies grow through deliberate design. People have ideas, they go out, realize those ideas, and we can also incentivize them to have ideas. So we as experts or as administrators can increase growth by incentivizing research, say, into these new ideas. And so this is the kind of standard growth theory model of this ideas-based growth, which has technology, capital, and labor, and sort of its usual combinatorial way. And we've got the change in technology being some function of research labor, is what we call it, and some factor that we are able to control the amount of research being done. Oops, I keep doing that. Sorry. I'll go away. Okay. And so how do we control that as administrators or as experts? We have a wage that we give to researchers, and we get this additional amount, basically, a fraction of growth that's relative to how much money we give to the people who do the research. So L sub A sub T are the researchers. So this is basically a very kind of simple model of dumping money into a research apparatus, right? Because those researchers are going to then get the ideas. And that's what we call modern growth right now. But what is accelerating growth? The modern growth leads to an exponential model of growth with constant relative rates of growth. It's like a straight line for relative rates of growth. And we are able to do things like growth pinning, saying, oh yes, the economy is going to grow at, let's say 3% a year, and we could target, that 3%. And that's a constant relative rate of growth in GDP. And we're able to do things like growth targeting in this model. But with accelerating growth, the story changes. So we have here a slightly altered version of the equation I showed you before, which has these new combinations being added. And we have the sort of where we start is m sub t minus 1. So this is the previous time step. And then we add on new stuff using this combinatorial model, the sum over new combinations that can be up to the full amount of stuff in the system. And we suppress that with alpha sub I a little bit. We suppress it a bit more with P. And P can also contain information about institutions that enable or constrain growth, but we're not quite at that point yet, theoretically, to describe exactly that process. And the m sub t that we get in the new period is going to be a combination of what was existed last period plus the new stuff, plus how we've been able to traverse that adjacent possible. We haven't been able to see the full thing, but we've been able to get some of it out. And so now we have a new economic possibility space with this amount of stuff. And we can directly relate that to the GDP or growth of the system by using this kind of model, where we have m sub t, which is this amount of stuff in the system standing in for technology. So the number of combinations in the system, what exists in the system, stands in for the technological term of the traditional growth theory model. And our capital is constrained just like usual. You can save some, There's depreciation. And we have a very few number of parameters. By the way, this model has 13 parameters needed to identify it, to make it look like what actual growth, the growth series looks like. And this model, our model only has 4. So it's a much simpler model. And we do some basic things. This is all what I had to discover all these values through basically brute force and also testing the whole space of possibilities of parameters, the whole parameter space. And then we bring in some facts that are growth theory facts that have been established in some major papers. Like, of course, what was the initial GDP at 81 the first year? That's from the Madison Project. What the depreciation rate is, what the savings rate is. Depreciation's here. Capital share of output and savings rate. So we just bring those in from the most updated growth theory facts research. And then we're able to get a pretty nice fit. This shows you just a zoom on the elbow, but I'll show you here first. From 0 to year 2015, we have a variety of parameterizations of this model, of our model, that hew pretty closely. Some of them hew better than others to this line. We theorize that it gets off track up here a little bit, mainly because we're not actually taking into account some of the ways in which we've been enriched by, say, zero price goods, software, and internet-based goods, intangible goods. We're not quite taking those into account in GDP in the way that they've actually enriched our lives. So they haven't quite come into GDP directly, but that's a whole other argument. So our main picture here is this little zoom on our parameterizations to show how they're able to hew pretty close to this blue line, which you can kind of see is the growth theory, the actual data on growth. Okay, so what does accelerating growth predict? So before I had my piecemeal circumnavigation thesis, I talked about how accelerating growth is going to create an explosion in possibilities, and it's going to be relatively impossible to keep up, at least keep the same sort of lag time between being able to react to a new thing entering the system, say through a regulation or some other kind of constraint or control, and the actual bringing in of the new thing in the system. So between it arriving in the possibility space and an administrator's ability to react to it in order to constrain it or control it. So as growth accelerates, the prediction horizon will shorten. So the ability, first of all, the ability to actually see into the adjacent possible is going to become shorter and shorter as growth accelerates. We're going to have more and more things being brought in more and more quickly. So our ability to see sort of beyond the prediction horizon is in units of time. So we can think of this in terms of, I don't know, 1950, you could predict out 10, 20 years and generally have a good picture of the technological landscape of your system. But in 2020 or 22, maybe it's 5 years, only 5 years that you can really kind of think about what the technological landscape of our human system is going to be like in 5 years and have a pretty good picture. In fact, it might even be shorter than 5 years now. And so the idea is that this prediction horizon, our ability to kind of look into the adjacent possible and have a good idea of what's going to happen in a certain amount of time is getting shorter and shorter. So this means, of course, that policies intended for one kind of system that stays the same, say, for longer than it's predicted to, or longer than it actually does, are instead implemented on a different kind of system. So if your system is changing faster than you expect as an administrator, as a controller, then you're going to have a policy that is relevant for one kind of system that becomes irrelevant, perhaps even by the time it's implemented. That the system has changed so quickly that in ways, of course, that you couldn't predict as the administrator, policymaker, or expert, that the policy that you would have implemented might have worked if the system had stayed the same, but it hadn't. It hasn't. The system has changed, and too quickly and in unknowable ways. And so you can have policy failure happening at a more rapid rate. So by definition, policies can't take into account what is beyond the adjacent possible. Right? And so that brings us back, and now I don't necessarily need to go over it, but this is where really this piecemeal circumnavigation thesis comes in, is that this this prediction horizon is getting shorter and shorter. The lag time between the ability of the controller to apprehend new things and actually be able to react to them is getting longer and longer. And then with the accelerating growth model, we have its formal implications is that we have a repeller. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if you try to control a system that changes. So this is before the policies say these are very hard to read. This is time axis. You're at time 0 here, this is time t. And then you have some system's state. This curve characterizes a system. And you think that the system is going to remain the same until time t. And so we can characterize this like a surface, right? That has a dimension along time. And this curve here is your policy space. And this axis is benefit. So say, for instance, you start here. Your system starts here. And you want to knock the system into a higher valley where you have a more beneficial, higher social welfare system state. So you want to knock the system over here. If the system stays like this over time, you might be able to do that. Of course, your policy is going to unravel in time. But if it all stays the same, your policy unravels, but if you knock it up here, it'll still get to the same point because your policy is going to be, will be relevant, continue to be relevant for a system that stays the same. And say, for instance, after the policy, you're able to alter the system such that you can you can knock this ball up in it. Instead of getting caught in a suboptimal valley, it will go into the more optimal valley. Now, in a shortened prediction horizon, what happens is that you have a system, but it changes after the prediction horizon. So here, this is 0, and this system is ending at h sub t, which is our prediction horizon. And then you have this bit beyond where the system changes. Now, if your policy isn't enacted fast enough, you'll be enacting it up here, and you might end up with a surface that's a bit different, where you could try to roll the ball over down there, but it's not going to go. It's just going to roll back into the suboptimal state. So you no longer have this nice optimal surface where you can roll the ball down and get to a better sort of welfare state by knocking it this way. And actually now, if you're implementing the policy on this surface unwittingly because you can't see how the system changes after the prediction horizon, then you're going to not be able to attain that better state, and you're going to end up in possibly a worse state than you started in. Depends on where you start from. So here's a little illustration of how the relative rate of combinatorial growth is itself explosive and combinatorial. So in traditional growth theory models, we have our growth, and then we have the relative rate of growth here is in red. That's kind of just a straight constant. It's a straight line. And we show here the relative rates of growth of an accelerating growth model actually change even faster than the actual model, the black itself. So this means, of course, in an accelerating growth model, we have to determine whether or not we have equilibrium states, saddle points. This is the equilibrium state that you can get in one direction, but if you move your nudge system in the other direction, you can become moved away from that equilibrium state. Or if we're dealing with repellers, which are like the top of a hill, where if you nudge the state in any direction, it's going to fly away from that precarious top of the hill. And we discover when we actually do some simulations with Our growth theory model, as we stated before, with a combinatorial technology process, that we get what looks very much like a separating hyperplane, which is the kind of main evidence that you are dealing with a repeller. And so you have, some number of combinations. If you get even a little bit above or below that, your system explodes or it collapses. Let's explain the graph a little bit. We have number of combinations on the y-axis, and time is on the x-axis. And here it's just number of steps of the simulation. And we have various trajectories here. We start out with initial combinations. In red, it's 100. Pink, it's 100. Red, it's 110. Gray, it's 115. And black, it's 120. So if you start out with more initial combinations, your system's more likely to explode. And what's this 5% mean? This is our combinatorial deaths per period. We're removing 5% of all possibilities in the possibility space every single time step. So by 30, we've removed 5% 30 times of each step. And so this is, even though, of course, growth is combinatorial. So you can, of course, make the system decline. Even with explosive growth, you can squeeze that system down a bit. But you're not going, but if you do that and you're continuing to ban at 5%, you're never going to see the system grow. It's in fact going to decline in each step. And at 10%, this is even more marked. So you can start at a higher level of initial combinations and still be able to, get decline. But you are on another knife's edge, and it's a different knife edge this time. It's a bit higher up, and you're going to see this explosive growth or decline very, very close to this knife edge. And we'll talk about, kind of hinted at it, how close you can be to the knife's edge. 30% deaths at each stage. You're taking out 30% of the possibilities of the system at every single stage of growth. You still get this repeller state that's being repelled from around 320 or so, it looks like. And 50%, you're still getting it. And you can go all the way up to 80 and close 99 and still get some explosive growth if you have a high enough number of combinations. And so, yeah, this axis is very boring because it's not showing the precision out here to 10 to the minus 8. And this is an illustration to show just how precise you have to be as an administrator to be able to plan, this system. And it's very unrealistically precise, as in no administrator is able to even get close to this kind of precision, and is basically impossible. And even so, you're just sticking on this straight line forever. And so we have a plot where the explosions happen. There are a certain number of combinations with deaths in the system, a certain fraction of deaths in the system. So even very small amount of combinations where you start with initial combinations in the opportunity space, the initial size of the opportunity space, a small amount of fraction of deaths, you're still going to see explosion, of course. So if you're not actually trying to destroy the system, not doing any destructive activity, you will see explosive growth even with very small number of initial stuff in the system to work with. And as you destroy more and more of the system at each time step, you need a higher level of initial combinations in order to truly destroy the system. But you can. That's the collapse zone. So even with a high number of initial combinations, say out here, if you get past 95% death where you're really destroying the system, this is a war, perhaps, you can cause the entire system to collapse. So before I thank you, I also want to note that there are applications to this kind of thinking. So the applications to this kind of thinking, it gives us a way of understanding, say, degrowth policies. We've heard maybe about décroissance. This is the theory of degrowth as popular among social scientists who are also environmentalists. And so this kind of degrowth means that, oh, well, what we can do in order to avoid climate change is to actually shrink the size of the system that, say, emits carbon. So this is our social system, our entire system of humanity emits carbon. So we have a problem with carbon emissions causing, this spiraling rapid increase in global temperatures. What if we just made the system smaller than it is right now? So, yes, you could try to do that, but how can you really control, whether or not the system remains small enough to be able to suppress carbon emissions to the extent that you need them to be suppressed, or if you're actually just destroying the entire system of humanity through this effort of degrowth? You can't really walk that knife's edge. You're either going to basically do nothing, or destroy a lot of stuff, but the system's going to explode anyway, or you're going to destroy the system entirely, which I don't think is really the desire of folks who work in this space to talk about degrowth. So this theory tends to work against the idea that degrowth is a possible carbon mitigation strategy. This theory can also help us understand the difference between, say, North and South Korea. We have a system that has essentially been degrowing very slowly in North Korea, and then a system over the border that has been experiencing explosive growth. Both started at the same point. One had, they diverged when one started destroying possibilities in the system, essentially, constraining the system's future. And we can see that one is slowly in the collapse zone, and the other is firmly in the explosion zone. So the theory of growth with a repeller state can help us understand how countries can diverge like this. Okay, so that's my talk for today. I think I've got 8 minutes left for questions, and I would love to hear from you. Jim.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
Couple comments. One, I think this distinction between type 0 and type 1 growth kind of opens the window into the problem that you identified of matching GDP growth to the results that you're getting in late years. So I think also in the early years, it seems like you may be assuming, I don't know, maybe you're not, but that type 1 growth should correlate with GDP growth. And then you're like, well, there's some deviation, and we're going to explain that as like enrichment that we're not capturing with GDP. But it seems another possible explanation is that type 1 growth is enabling expansion of type 0 combinations, right? And then GDP is within a subset of the type 0 when whatever the state is.
Okay, so Jim's comment, I'm going to repeat it for Zoom and such, is that if I get you right, that type 0, well, 0 and 1 are together. I think you're talking about type 2 is the creative growth. That this creative growth can be understood in addition to a more traditional type 0, type 1 search growth that can better define what the actual growth in GDP curve is doing.
Right. So the end of this comment is that maybe you think about the beginning of the takeoff, because at the beginning of the takeoff, there's a ton of new potential created probably between the end of the 16th and beginning of the 18th century in terms of new technologies, new forms of trade, new financial instruments, new forms of governance, all these things that precede the takeoff. And this is Joe Mokyr, really, the Joe Mokyr story, right? There's a bunch of potential created, and then we see GDP grow, right? I think that might work well with trying to figure out why you're getting this growth in combinations, but it doesn't quite match the GDP growth. That makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. So the idea here is that we have to look more deeply into the takeoff, as it were, beginning of the takeoff, in order to understand why we're diverging in the model. The model, of course, is extremely simple. And it's only our toy model, really, not our formal growth theory model, which is in development. But that could take into account, say, for instance, your comments about looking more deeply into the takeoff, the meat of the takeoff and what's going on. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Second comment is
Second.
that, and I actually made this comment to Roger at SDA.
Roger is one of my co-authors. Thanks.
So the other thing is that you're framing degradation of potential combinations, degradation of combination space as a function of regulation. But there may also be, right, some changes in the combinatorial space can also be limiting in some respects as well. There may be endogenous decay to knowledge that I think is worth considering as you're framing this, right? Maybe some of it can be thought as regulation. It tends to cut off more possibilities than it creates. It's just the nature of the thing. But the change in knowledge itself is transforming the opportunity space so that maybe new opportunities over here literally delimit the pre-existing opportunities.
Sure. It's unclear how to model that as a difference in size. Like, say, for instance, we didn't go down, path A, which would have opened up a larger possibility space, because we went down path B, and we now get a narrower one. It's unclear how to formally talk about that. But something to note too is that knowledge itself, what we're able to understand as we traverse the possibility space, is not just in our grasp. So we may have limitations to our ability to understand things. Particularly, I can think of, imagine, 1984 has descended upon us, and we're afraid of doing anything outside sort of a little conformist narrow path. We're disincentivized from learning anything. We're in fact being taught wrong things and incentivized to repeat them back in order to show compliance to some sort of authoritarian state. Essentially, I hope I model this through the destruction of that system. And I'm showing that as the system itself declining. What's interesting to note about this model is that we're talking very broadly here, very globally, and we're essentially able to swirl around some institutional issues by having a large enough variation and variance in institutions in the mix of our model to kind of get around, oops, we backed ourselves into a cultural corner here with respect to understanding knowledge. Not sure if that answers some of what you're concerned about. These are all important issues. Epistemology as the underlying process here that we have to deal with, how we gain new knowledge, how we utilize that knowledge, is absolutely essential to understanding sort of the process level part of what's going on in a model like this. And we also have, of course, no one's really brought it up, but to mention that it's not just people that we're interested in expanding the opportunity space. So there's, to some extent, this explosive growth can't be explosive forever if we're dealing just with humans, because humans have constrained time and resources to explore new possibilities. But of course, we also create things like artificial intelligence, which may have more ability to keep exploring new possibilities. And that kind of AI is not very viable yet, but it's not that unforeseeable in terms of its viability. Even if we're just running a program to search for ways in order to get from A to B using, say, machine learning techniques that's continually updated with new data as we go along in time, that is assisting us in being able to search for how to get to point B from point A, even if we as individuals aren't necessarily doing that. That uses resources too, but I think the amount of resources that are utilized in that way are much smaller. And so there may be much more growth available in the system before we sort of hit some kind of limitation. We don't model the limitation to explosive growth. This is something Jones and Romer try to model, having to do with mortality rates, births and deaths, because they assume that just humans are producing new possibilities. And we don't necessarily want to assume that, nor do we want to assume some kind of stable rate. Yeah, any other questions?
So I'll just ask the last question, because
Okay.
We're almost out of time here, but so if we believe your model, so should we take this as a sign of good news? Because you think about the explosive growth that's occurred in the past. We have a lot more combinations available to us now than we would have in the past as a world. So it should be a lot harder to screw things up. Am I right? I mean, in other words, for the administrative state to actually screw things up, it's more effort that they need.
I would think that this system is more resilient to interventionary screwing up. I think is what I would say. The system would be more resilient. Of course, the system is more chaotic in terms of what can happen that is seen as like a social bad that can enter the system. So things that people can do privately that might enter the system, new opportunities that are seen as socially not great. And so one can say that it's harder and harder to intervene in the system in a negative way, but it's also harder and harder to intervene in the system in a positive way, if we can even define what that means. Which is kind of murky. But if you assume that there are some positive ways to intervene, then yeah, so it limits both. Thanks.
So great job.
Great. Thank you.